The moment Valentina Wolfe pressed her palm to Vesper Nightborne's chest and felt the darkness writhing beneath his skin like a living thing trying to claw its way out of him, she understood with absolute bone-deep certainty that every warning she had ever been given was wrong. "Get away from him," the voice came from behind her, cold and commanding and ancient with authority. Councillor Malachar Voss stood at the edge of the grand chamber, his white hair swept back from a face carved from centuries of contempt, his pale eyes fixed on her like she was something small and foolish standing too close to a fire. "You are a human girl. You have no idea what you are touching. I know exactly what I am touching," Valentina said, and she did not move her hand. The chamber itself seemed to breathe around her. Deep beneath the streets of Vienna, in the secret court of the Nightborne bloodline, everything was black marble and red candlelight, and the weight of 1,000 years of blood law pressing down on the air. The assembled vampire nobles watched her from their tiered seats with expressions ranging from cold amusement to outright fury, their pale faces and white hair and ancient, gorgeous cruelty, all directed at the human girl in the dark dress who had dared to step between their lord and whatever had taken hold of him. Vesper was on his knees. She had never seen him on his knees. In the 3 months since the bond between them had formed, she had seen him commanding rooms full of immortal nobles who had lived longer than most nations. She had seen him quiet an entire court with a single look, seen him hold power like it was something he had been born wearing. She had seen him furious and controlled, and occasionally, heartbreakingly, she had seen him gentle. She had never seen him defeated, but he was now, and the darkness that was taking him apart from the inside was doing it so quietly, so methodically, that most of the court had not yet understood what they were watching. They thought this was a political collapse. They thought this was weakness. They thought this was the inevitable failure of a lord who had made the catastrophic mistake of bonding himself to a human waitress from a restaurant in the 7th district of Vienna. They were about to learn. They were wrong about all of it. But to understand how Valentina Wolfe came to be standing with her hand pressed to a vampire lord's chest in the secret court of the Nightborne bloodline, it was necessary to understand 3 months earlier, when she had known nothing about courts or blood law or ancient vows, and the most dangerous thing in her life had been the dinner rush on a Friday night. She had been working at Nachtgold for 2 years when he first came in. Nachtgold was the kind of restaurant that did not advertise. It did not need to. It existed in a building that had stood in the 1st district of Vienna since 1743, all dark wood paneling and low chandeliers and wine lists that went back before anyone currently living had been born. The food was extraordinary. The clientele was old money at its oldest, and nobody on the staff asked too many questions about why certain guests never touched their meals, or why a particular private dining room was booked every second Tuesday under a name that Valentina had once tried to look up and found absolutely no record of anywhere. She had been carrying a tray of wine when Vesper Nightborne walked through the door for the first time, and the entire room changed temperature. She noticed it physically. A subtle drop, like the air conditioning, had been turned up, except that this was November, and there was no air conditioning running. She noticed the way the other guests at the bar straightened slightly, without seeming to know they were doing it. She noticed that Marco, the matron who had worked at Nachtgold for 17 years, and prided himself on never being impressed by anyone, went completely still for a moment before recovering. Then she turned and saw him and she thought, oh, he was tall, with the particular kind of height that took up space without trying. His hair was white, the kind of white that was not old age, but was instead something intrinsic and impossible, swept back from a face that was almost painfully handsome, in a way that she could not quite rationalize, because it was not symmetry alone, and it was not simply bone structure. It was the quality of attention in his face. It was the way his dark eyes moved through the room, like he was measuring the exact value and threat level of everything they landed on. And it was the moment those eyes landed on her that she understood, instinctively and immediately, that whatever this person was, he was not ordinary. He was with two others. One was a woman who moved like water and looked at the room with faint contempt, her white hair braided back, her pale face expressionless. The other was a man slightly shorter than Vesper, who watched the entrance carefully and positioned himself near the door with the particular alertness of someone whose job was security. Valentina delivered the wine she was carrying. She checked on table 7. She took a dessert order at table 3, and then Marco appeared at her elbow and murmured, "Table 12, the private alcove, only the best." His voice had a slightly odd quality to it, like someone pressing down carefully on each word. "Whatever he asks for, of course," she said. She went to table 12. He looked up at her when she arrived, and she had the strange, vertiginous sensation of being seen by something very old, looking at something unexpectedly interesting. "Good evening," she said, in the pleasant, professionally warm tone she had spent years perfecting. "My name is Valentina, and I will be looking after you tonight. Can I bring you something to begin?" "Water," he said. His voice was low and precise, with an accent she could not quite locate. "And the wine list." "Of course." She brought both. He looked at the wine list with the slight tilt of his head that very knowledgeable wine drinkers get when they are scanning for something specific, and she waited at the appropriate distance and did not fidget. "The 1947 Chateau Latour," he said, without looking up. "If you still have it, we do," she said. "That is an exceptional choice." He did look up then. "You know it." "I know it was considered one of the greatest vintages of the 20th century," she said. "Extraordinary concentration, legendary longevity. We have 4 bottles left in the cellar." She paused. "I am told it is worth approximately 12,000 euros per bottle." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "You are told correctly." He held her gaze for just a moment longer than was socially standard. "Please bring one." She brought one. He came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. He always sat at table 12, always in the private alcove, sometimes alone, and sometimes with the same 2 companions. He always ordered the extraordinary wine, and occasionally food he did not appear to eat, and he always asked for Valentina specifically. Over the course of 4 weeks, she learned things about him in small pieces because he was the sort of person who did not offer information freely, but who, she came to understand, was quietly testing whether she would ask. She asked good questions at the right moments and did not ask bad ones. She learned that he had homes in Vienna, Prague, and Budapest. She learned that he had opinions about architecture that were specific and detailed and personal in a way that suggested he had not simply read about these buildings, but had watched them being constructed. She learned that he had read nearly everything and had thoughts about all of it, and that he did not say these thoughts casually, but with a precision that made her feel like she was being given something carefully chosen. She did not learn what he was until the 5th week. On a night when a man came into the restaurant with a weapon and intentions that were clearly violent, and Vesper Nightborne crossed the room in a movement that was not physically possible for a human being, and had the situation resolved before anyone had quite processed that it had begun. Valentina, who had been standing 4 feet away, had seen all of it. Afterward, when the police had been called and the story had been managed in ways she also did not entirely understand, he found her in the back hallway, near the kitchen entrance, and he looked at her with those careful, measuring eyes and said, "You are not frightened." "I am," she said honestly. "I am very frightened, but not of you." Something in his face shifted in a way that she did not have the vocabulary for yet. Most people would be. You just protected an entire room full of people at what appeared to be considerable personal cost, she said, because she had seen the way he had moved and the way he had looked afterward, slightly strained around the edges in a way he would never usually permit. "What you are is less alarming to me than what you just did. You know what I am. I have been working here for 2 years, she said. I am not naive." "A beat, you should sit down." He stared at her. "I beg your pardon. You look like you need to sit down," she said, in exactly the same tone she used when she thought a customer had drunk slightly more than was wise and needed to be redirected gently. "There is a chair just there. I am going to bring you a glass of water, which I understand will not do what it would do for me, but it is the thing I have available, and I suspect the gesture has value even so." For a long moment, Vesper Nightborne said nothing. Then he sat down. She brought him water. She sat across from him without being invited, because the situation warranted it, and they stayed there in the narrow back hallway, with the kitchen sounds beyond the door, and he told her enough of the truth that she could begin to understand the shape of his world. Vampires, ancient, hierarchical, politically complex, and extraordinarily dangerous. A court hidden beneath this city that predated the city itself. Blood law that governed every aspect of their existence, from feeding to alliances to succession. An intricate architecture of obligation and honor and power that was entirely invisible to the human world existing above it. And Vesper Nightborne was lord of all of it. "Why do you come here?" she asked. "To a restaurant, to public spaces?" "Because I find them grounding," he said. And then, more quietly, "Because I find you grounding." She looked at him directly. "You barely know me." "I know you better than you think," he said. "I have been watching you work for 5 weeks. I have observed the way you manage this room, the way you read people, the way you are precise and kind simultaneously, which is considerably rarer than you might imagine. The way you handle disruption without losing composure." His eyes met hers steadily. "I find it remarkable." She thought about this carefully. "You are telling me this because something happened tonight that changed the nature of what we are to each other." His expression was complicated in a way she was beginning to learn to read. "I am telling you this because I owe you honesty after what you witnessed, and because—" He stopped. "Because," she said, "because the thing that brought me back here every week was not the wine," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The wine is excellent. The wine is excellent," he agreed, with the thing adjacent to a smile, but it was not the wine. The bond happened 3 weeks later, and it was not intentional. He had taken her to the court beneath the city because she had asked, and because he trusted her judgment in a way that she understood was unusual and significant, and because the political situation in the Nightborne bloodline had become complicated enough that having a human who understood what was happening and could operate within both worlds simultaneously had begun to seem strategically valuable, which was what he told himself, and which was only partially true. The court was breathtaking and frightening in equal measure. Valentina walked through it with her chin up, and her expression calm, and her hands steady, which was the result of considerable internal effort, because the assembled vampire nobles were looking at her like she was something that had wandered in from a world that was not theirs, and had not been invited. Councillor Malachar Voss had made his feelings clear immediately. "She is a human," he said to Vesper, not bothering to lower his voice because he did not consider her capable of requiring that courtesy. "Bringing her here is a violation of the fourth accord. Humans are not permitted below the threshold without blood law binding. The fourth accord applies to humans brought for feeding," Vesper said, in the tone he used when he was explaining something to someone who was deliberately being obtuse. "Miss Wolfe is here as a guest under my personal protection. Personal protection is not a recognized category under blood law. It is under the Nightborne Charter of 1683, Vesper said, which supersedes the fourth accord in matters of lordly discretion. If you would like to review the charter, Malachar, I have a copy." Malachar had not liked that. He had looked at Valentina with those pale, contemptuous eyes and said, "You will regret bringing a mortal into this court. They are fragile, they are temporary, and they are a liability." "Thank you for your perspective," Valentina had said politely, because Vesper had gone slightly rigid beside her in the particular way that meant he was about to say something that would cost him politically, and she was not going to let that happen on her behalf. "I appreciate that you are concerned for your lord's interests. So am I." The silence that followed had been extraordinary. The bond itself had been an accident, or at least it had begun that way. There was a moment in the deeper chambers of the court, away from the assembled nobles, when they had been standing close together in a candlelit corridor, discussing the political landscape, and he had put his hand briefly against her face to brush away a strand of her dark hair that had fallen across her cheek, and she had turned into the touch without meaning to, and the ancient power that ran beneath everything in this court had recognized something. She felt it like a key and turning in a lock she had not known she contained. He had stepped back immediately. His expression had shifted into something she could not read at all, which was unusual, because she had become very good at reading him. "That should not have happened," he said. "What happened?" she asked. "A recognition," he said, "very old piece of blood law. The kind that—" He stopped, ran a hand through his white hair in a gesture that she had learned was his tell for genuine distress. "I need to think." She waited. "A bond," he said at last carefully. "It is called a resonance bond. It occurs rarely. It occurs when two people of exceptional compatibility exist in close proximity during a moment of significant emotional honesty. It is the court will not approve. The court does not of me," she pointed out. "This is different," he met her eyes. "Valentina, a resonance bond is permanent. It cannot be undone. It creates a connection between two people that is real and meaningful, and it has implications for both parties that I need to discuss with you at length before you decide how you feel about it." She considered this. "Is it hurting you? No. Is it hurting me? Not currently." "No, then," she said, "discuss it with me." He did, for 3 hours in the candlelit chamber. He told her everything, the way the bond would develop between them, the way it would make her more aware of his emotional state and him more aware of hers, the way the court would react, and the way Malachar and those aligned with him would try to use it as evidence that Vesper was compromised and unfit to lead. The way it would put her at risk, because she would be seen as a vulnerability, and his enemies would target her. "There is no magical solution to the risk it creates for you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I cannot transfer the bond or dissolve it. I can refuse to acknowledge it publicly, which would protect you somewhat, but would require us to behave as though it does not exist, which I understand from everything I know about you is not something you would be willing to do." "Correct," she said. "I can acknowledge it, and have you formally registered under my personal protection with the full weight of Nightborne law behind it, which protects you legally within this world, but makes you a political target." "What would you prefer?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "I would prefer that you are safe," he said. "I would prefer that your life is not complicated by my world. I would prefer—" He stopped, and in the pause she heard everything he was not saying. "Vesper," she said. "Yes. I am a waitress in a restaurant that serves vampires," she said. "My life was already complicated by your world. The only question was whether I was going to face it with information or without it." She held his gaze. Register the bond. He registered it. The 3 months between that night and the night in the great chamber had been the most vivid of her life. She had continued working at Nacht Gold because the work grounded her and she was good at it. And walking away from her life was not something she was willing to do, simply because her life had expanded to include a dimension that most people did not know existed. She had also spent considerable time in the court beneath Vienna, learning its geography and its politics and its people, because if she was going to be part of this world, she was going to understand it properly. She learned that Malakar Voss was not simply politically opposed to her presence, but was actively working to undermine Vesper's authority, using the bond as his primary argument. She learned that there were 3 other noble houses in the Nightborne court, and that 2 of them were neutral on the question of Vesper's human bond, and one of them, House Cerevane, represented by a vampire named Calix Cerevane, who was sharp and precise, and had the air of someone who was always 3 moves ahead of everyone else, was quietly watching the situation, with the particular attention of someone who expected it to be useful. She did not entirely trust Calix Cerevane. She told Vesper this, and he told her that her instincts were sound, and that Calix had been working to position himself as an alternative power center in the court for approximately the last decade, and that the situation with the bond had given him ammunition he had not previously possessed. "What would he need to move against you directly?" she asked. "Evidence of incapacity," Vesper said. "A vampire lord who cannot fulfill his primary function, which is to govern and protect his court, is liable to challenge. The challenge takes the form of a tribunal, and if the tribunal finds against the sitting lord, the seat passes." He paused. "The bond is not itself evidence of incapacity, but if my enemies can demonstrate that it has made me emotionally compromised to the point where I cannot make sound decisions, they can request a tribunal. Have you made any decisions they could characterize that way?" "Not yet." His jaw tightened slightly. "They are working to manufacture one." She thought about this. "Then we need to make sure they cannot," she said. "What do you need from me?" He looked at her with an expression that she had come to recognize as the one he used when he was moved and did not want to show it. "I need you to be careful," he said. "I need you to be aware that the people who want to use you as a weapon against me will not necessarily do so overtly." "I can handle subtle," she said. "I know," he said. "That is not what worries me." "What does?" The parts that are not subtle, he said. If the subtle approach fails, Malachar and those with him will not stop there. She understood what he was telling her. She understood the danger precisely and practically, and she adjusted her daily routines accordingly, and she told herself that she was managing the situation sensibly, and that the flutter of something warm and complicated in her chest every time she was near Vesper Nightborne was a separate matter to be addressed separately. She loved him. She had known it for weeks, with the same clarity she brought to everything she knew. She had not told him, because the timing had not been right, and because she was, despite everything, slightly afraid of his reaction to it, which was not something she admitted too often. She was afraid not because she thought he would be unkind, but because she was increasingly certain that he felt the same way and was equally afraid of his own reaction to it, and the two of them moving carefully around the fact of their feelings, while managing an immortal political crisis, was beginning to feel slightly absurd. The crisis came to a head on a Tuesday. She was at the restaurant when the message arrived, carried, not by phone, but by a piece of actual paper, delivered by a young man whose eyes were slightly glazed in the particular way that meant he was carrying it under compulsion and would remember nothing afterward. The paper said, in handwriting she recognized as belonging to the woman who was Vesper's primary court secretary, a vampire named Thessaly, who was brisk and competent, and one of the few members of the court who had accepted Valentina without visible reservation. Come immediately. The chamber. Something has happened to the Lord. She did not stop to change her clothes. She went. The court beneath Vienna was accessed through 3 different points in the city, each concealed in ways that were elegant and entirely unnoticeable to anyone not looking for them. Valentina used the one nearest the restaurant, through a wine cellar that connected to a corridor, that connected to a descending staircase that had been here since before anyone now living had built the city above it. She had made this journey enough times in the last 3 months that she moved quickly and without hesitation. She emerged into the outer court to find it in controlled chaos. Thessaly was at her side within seconds, pulling her along the corridor with a grip that was not rough, but was absolutely firm. 3 hours ago, Thessaly said, her voice low and precise. He was in the archive chamber reviewing treaty documents. Calix Seravain was with him. Whatever happened, it happened there. Calix left. The Lord did not. What condition is he in? Deteriorating, Thessaly said. Physically present. Cognitively, she paused. Something is happening inside him. Something dark. What kind of dark? Valentina said. The kind that has a name in very old blood lore, Thessaly said. The kind that is not supposed to be possible unless someone initiates it deliberately. Valentina stopped walking. Calix initiated it. We cannot prove it yet. We do not need to prove it yet, she said. We need to stop what is happening to Vesper, and then we can prove it. She looked at Thessaly directly. What is it called? The thing that is happening. Thessaly was quiet for a moment. In the old language, it is called the veil consumption. It is a very ancient piece of darkness that can be used as a weapon. It enters through the blood. It begins to consume the consciousness, the decision-making capacity, the fundamental sense of self. If it completes, the person who comes out the other side is... She stopped. They are not the same person. How do you stop it? That is the difficulty, Thessaly said. Under blood law, there is only one recorded mechanism for stopping a veil consumption once it has taken hold. It requires a tether, a living tether, someone whose bond to the afflicted person is strong enough to serve as an anchor point. She paused for just a moment. A resonance bond would qualify. Valentina started walking again. Take me to him. The great chamber was full when she arrived, because the political architecture of the court meant that any crisis involving the Lord drew witnesses, whether he wanted them or not. And she walked through the assembled nobles with her chin up and her expression absolutely steady. And she did not look at Malachar Voss when he stepped into her path. You are not permitted in a Lord's crisis chamber, Malachar said, under the seventh accord, under the Nightborne Charter of 1683, she said, using Vesper's own precedent back at him. A bond partner holds right of access to a bonded lord in any circumstance relating to the lord's health or capacity, which supersedes the seventh accord. She held his gaze. Move, please. He moved. He did not want to, but he moved, and then she saw Vesper, and her heart did something painful. He was on his knees at the center of the chamber, and the darkness she had been warned about was visible, barely, as something like a shadow that moved independent of the light, coiling around him in patterns that made her eyes hurt slightly if she tried to focus on them directly. His white hair was slightly disheveled. His eyes, when they found hers across the chamber, were the eyes of a man who was fighting something with everything he had and beginning to lose. She crossed the room. Get away from him, Malachar said from behind her. I know exactly what I am touching, she said, and pressed her palm to Vesper's chest. The bond activated. She had been told that the resonance bond would develop over time and express itself in moments of emotional significance. And this was the most significant moment they had shared, and it expressed itself like a current running through both of them, simultaneously, warm and certain and unmistakably alive. She felt his presence the way she might feel the sun on her face, immediate and undeniable, and she felt the darkness that was working against him as something cold and deliberate and deeply, deeply hostile to everything that he was. She understood, in that moment, what Thessaly had meant by a tether. The bond was not magical in a simple, comfortable way. It was not a spell that would dissolve the darkness automatically. It was a connection, and like all connections, it required both parties to use it actively. It required her to hold her ground and hold the warmth of what was between them steady against the cold that was eating at him from the inside. Vesper, she said quietly, not asking anything of him, just giving him the anchor point, and his hand came up and closed around her wrist. Not desperately, deliberately, with the particular precision that was his. She felt the darkness push back hard in response, felt it resist the intrusion of warmth, and it took everything she had to keep her hand steady, and her mind clear, and her presence in this moment absolute. Everyone in this chamber is watching you fail, Malachar said from behind her, and his voice had a quality to it that she recognized suddenly as theatrical. He was performing for the witnesses. He had wanted this crisis. He had perhaps arranged it with Calix, and now he was narrating it, trying to shape the record of what happened here. A human child, pressing her hands to our Lord, and believing she can do what 3 centuries of vampire power cannot. This is what the bond has cost him. This sentimentality, this weakness. Be quiet, said a new voice. Valentina recognized it. Calix Seravain from the tiered seats. She had not expected that. I beg your pardon? Malachar said. I said, be quiet, Calix said, and his voice had shed the careful, measured quality he usually wore. He was standing now, and he looked. She could not quite interpret his expression. Not guilty, exactly, something more complicated than guilt. I know what I did. I know what was used, and I know that what is happening between them right now is the only thing that can stop it. He met Valentina's eyes across the chamber. "Do not let go." "I had no intention of letting go," she said. The darkness pushed back again, and this time it was aggressive enough that the physical temperature of the chamber dropped noticeably, and she heard several of the assembled nobles make sounds of involuntary alarm. But the warmth of the bond between her and Vesper held, and she kept her palm flat against his chest and her wrist in his grip and her attention entirely on him. "You need to stop fighting it alone," she said to him quietly. "You need to let the connection do what it is built to do." "I am trying to protect you from the pull of it," he said, his voice strained in a way she had never heard before. "I do not need protecting from the pull of it," she said. "I need you to let me help you. That is different." Something shifted in his expression, and she thought that he might have been on the edge of this same emotional realization for months, the same understanding that was easier to articulate in a crisis than in an ordinary moment, that the protection he wanted to offer her was not what she needed, and the help she wanted to give him was not what he thought he was allowed to accept. He let go, not of her wrist. He let go of the control he was using to manage the darkness alone, and the bond flooded through the space that left, warm and real and anchored in 3 months of knowing each other, with increasing depth and honesty. She felt it like breathing. She felt his trust in it, and her own, and the darkness that had been designed to consume him found the warmth and recoiled. It took approximately 4 minutes by the clock on the wall, though it felt both faster and slower than that. The coiling shadow that hurt to look at unwound gradually, and then rapidly, and the temperature in the chamber rose back to normal, and the visible tension in Vesper's body released in stages, until he was simply kneeling, with her hand against his chest and his grip on her wrist, in the center of the great chamber of the Nightborne court, with every ancient vampire in the room watching them. He looked up at her. His dark eyes were clear, entirely clear, and in them she saw what she had suspected for months, rendered obvious by crisis in the way that crises render obvious the things we are most careful about in ordinary life. "You," he said, and his voice was quiet enough that it should not have carried. But the chamber had gone completely silent. "Are the most remarkable person I have ever encountered in 300 years. That is a very long time," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not entirely dry. "It is," he said, "and I have wasted considerable portions of it not saying things I should have said." He rose from his knees with the grace that was intrinsic to him, unhurried even now, and he did not release her wrist. He turned to face the chamber, still holding her hand, and the assembled court saw their lord, standing clear-eyed and intact in a way that should not have been possible, and they saw the human woman who had made it possible, and a significant number of them visibly reconsidered positions they had held for months. Malachar had not reconsidered anything. He was standing rigid with fury, and Valentina could see him calculating his next move in real time. "Lord Nightborne," he said, with the careful formality of someone about to invoke a formal procedure, "I move for tribunal review on the grounds of—" "On what grounds, precisely?" Calixeravane said. Malachar turned to look at him. "I beg your pardon. On what grounds?" Calix said clearly. "Would you move for tribunal? Our Lord is standing before us, entirely himself, which is more than can be said for the situation 1 hour ago. He descended from the tiered seats with the unhurried confidence of someone who had made a decision and intended to see it through. I should like to speak to the court before any motion is entertained." Vesper looked at Calix with an expression that was unreadable. "By all means," he said. Calix addressed the assembled nobles with the manner of someone who had been preparing this speech and understood the cost of giving it. 3 months ago, he said, I made a judgment that the resonance bond between Lord Nightborne and the human woman weakened our court's position. I acted on the judgment. I sought methods of testing the bond and finding it insufficient. He paused. What was done tonight to our Lord was initiated by someone acting on my behalf, and without my full understanding of the extent to which the method chosen would be dangerous. I believed it would demonstrate the bond's inadequacy. Instead, it demonstrated the opposite. He looked at Valentina. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about the bond. And what I permitted to be done tonight was... He stopped. It was a dark thing, and it should not have happened. Is it a formal admission before the court? Vesper said, his voice even. It is, Calix said, with all the legal and political consequences that entails. He held Vesper's gaze. I would rather face those consequences honestly than continue on the basis of a miscalculation. The chamber was very quiet. Malachar made one more attempt. Regardless of Calix Seravain's dramatic recantation, the underlying question of whether a human bond partner represents a systemic vulnerability to Nightborne leadership remains. Malachar, Vesper said. Something in his voice stopped every other sound in the room. Tonight, Vesper said, a mechanism designed to consume my consciousness and render me permanently incapacitated was used against me in this court. It was designed by people who knew that no vampire power within this court would be sufficient to stop it. It was designed to be unstoppable. He paused, and it was stopped. By the resonance bond, by a human woman who walked into this chamber and pressed her hand to my chest and held the warmth of what is between us against something that was trying to eat through me from the inside. He looked at Malachar with the particular quality of attention that had cleared rooms for 300 years. Tell me, Malachar, what vulnerability you are referring to. Because from where I stand, the bond between myself and Valentina Wolfe just proved to be the strongest thing in this court. The silence lasted for a long time. Malachar looked at the assembled faces and saw what the careful calculus of court politics had taught him to read. The moment when the room had moved past you. I will take the matter under further advisement, he said, and it was the most dignified retreat available to him, and everyone in the room heard it for exactly what it was. Please do, Vesper said. Afterward, when the chamber had gradually emptied and the formal proceedings had been suspended pending review of the night's events, and Calix Seravain had remained to begin the complicated process of accounting for what had been done, and Malachar had departed with the stiff dignity of someone who had lost and knew it, Valentina and Vesper stood in the corridor outside the great chamber with Thessaly a discreet distance away, and neither of them said anything for a moment. How do you feel? She asked. Considerably better than I did an hour ago, he said. How do you feel? Considerably more in love with you than I was willing to say before tonight, she said, because the crisis had burned away the careful management of timing and the slightly afraid of his reaction feeling. And what was left was simply the truth. He looked at her. The expression on his face was the thing she had been reading the edges of for months, finally unguarded and entirely visible. I have been, he said slowly, trying to determine how to tell you something for approximately 8 weeks. You are very thorough, she said. I wanted to be certain, he said. I wanted to be certain that what I felt was substantial enough to justify saying it, that it was not simply the bond-creating warmth that I was interpreting as something deeper and, she said, It is not the bond creating warmth, he said. The bond made it legible. The feeling itself is. He reached out and took her hand, the same wrist he had held in the chamber, and held it differently now, with the careful deliberateness of someone offering, rather than anchoring. 300 years, Valentina, and the specific quality of your attention is something I have not encountered before. The particular way you are brave, which is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it make your decisions. The way you walked into this court, into my world, and learned it on its own terms, without asking it to be simpler than it was. He paused. The way you just saved my life. You have saved my life 3 times since October, she said. The count is approximately even, he acknowledged. Then we are well matched, she said. We are extraordinarily well matched, he said, and something in his voice had shifted into a register that made her chest warm in the particular way she had become familiar with and deeply attached to, which is, I am told, the literal definition of a resonance bond. You should have led with that, she said, 8 weeks ago. I should have, he agreed. I am sorry. Stop being sorry and say what you were trying to say, she told him. He looked at her with those dark, clear eyes and the 300 years behind them and the particular quality of attention that she had been the object of since the first night he walked into Nachtgold, and he said, I love you. That is what I was trying to say. I have loved you, I think, since the night you handed me a glass of water in a back corridor and told me to sit down. You were being very dramatic about a physical strain, she said. I was, he said. It is a habit of my kind. We tend toward the theatrical. I know, she said. I love you too. I have loved you since approximately the 3rd Tuesday. She paused. The night you told me about the architecture of the Hagia Sophia, and I realized you were describing watching it being built. I was 600 years old, he said. I had opinions. You had wonderful opinions, she said. You still do. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles with the old-world formality that was entirely natural to him, and she felt the warmth of it run all the way up her arm. And she thought that this was perhaps the best moment she had ever had in a corridor, which was saying something. Because the corridors of the Nightborne court were extraordinary. There is still a great deal to resolve, he said against her hand. Calix's formal accounting, the question of Malachar, the documentation of what the veil consumption was, how it was introduced, and who was specifically responsible for the implementation. The political implications of the bond being publicly demonstrated as an asset rather than a liability. I know, she said. We will resolve it. Together, he said, which was not a question. Together, she confirmed. He let her hand down but did not release it, which was new, and she found she liked it very much. Thessaly appeared at a respectful distance. My lord, the Seravain matter requires your attention when you are ready. I will be there shortly, Vesper said. He looked at Valentina. Will you stay? I have the morning shift tomorrow, she said. Something moved in his expression that was very close to actual humor. Of course you do. The evening is young, she said. I will stay. The formal accounting of the Xalix-Seravain matter took 4 hours and was conducted in the smaller council chamber with Vesper presiding, and Valentina seated beside him, which was itself a statement that nobody challenged, because the court had watched what had happened in the great chamber, and the political mathematics had shifted in ways that would take time to fully calculate. Calix was precise and without self-pity in his accounting, which Valentina respected, even as she listened to the full extent of what had been planned against Vesper's clarity of mind and found herself quietly furious. The person who had specifically implemented the veil consumption was a minor court functionary who had been acting on Calix's general directive without being told the full nature of the weapon he was deploying. This did not entirely absolve Calix, and he did not argue that it should. The functionary had fled the court and was being located through channels Valentina did not ask to understand in detail. Cass accepted the formal censure of the council and the suspension of House Seravain's voting rights for a period of 10 years, and he did so with the demeanor of someone who had expected exactly this and found it fair. "One question," Valentina said, when the formal proceedings had concluded and the smaller council was beginning to disperse. She addressed Calix directly, which caused a brief pause in the ambient movement of the room, because it was still novel enough that a human spoke with full authority in this council. "You stopped Malachar from pursuing the tribunal motion. You did not need to do that." "No," Calix said. "Why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because what I did tonight was wrong," he said. "And when I saw you stop it, I understood that everything I had believed about the bond was wrong. The least I could do was say so clearly and let the record reflect it." He paused. "Malachar's motion would have been unjust. After tonight, it would also have been ridiculous, and I have little patience for injustice that is also ridiculous." She nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, "for the correction, if not the original action. A fair distinction," he said, and something in his expression suggested that he had a longer view of this moment and what it meant for the court, and that it was not a bad view. Malachar was a more complicated resolution, and it took the better part of the following week. The formal Fatir investigation into the night's events produced evidence that Malachar had been more directly involved in the planning of the veil consumption than Chess had initially known, that he had identified the weapon and made the connection to Calix's general displeasure with the bond, and had taken it upon himself to provide the implementation, believing that the result, a demonstrably incapacitated lord, would serve both his political agenda and the faction he represented. This evidence was presented to the full court in a formal proceeding that Valentina attended and Vesper presided over with the particular quality of controlled intensity that she had come to understand, was his version of deep feeling made external. Malachar was stripped of his council seat and formally censured, and given the option of voluntary exile from the Nightborne court, which he took with a stiff dignity that was apparently his primary mode of navigation through difficulty. He left on a Wednesday, and the court felt lighter afterward in a way that was probably both literal and metaphorical. 2 weeks as after the night in the great chamber, Vesper took Valentina up to the roof of the building that sat above the court's entrance, which was a private townhouse in the first district that had belonged to the Nightborne bloodline. For so long it had been rebuilt 3 times around the same foundations, and they stood on the rooftop in the cold December air with Vienna spread out below them, all lights and spires and the dark ribbon of the Danube in the distance. And she thought that she had grown up in this city and had never seen it look quite like this. "I want to show you something," he said. He led her to the edge of the roof and pointed out landmarks, but not the usual ones. He pointed out the building where the Second Nightborne Court had convened in 1718, before the underground chambers had been constructed. He pointed out the street where, in 1854, a skirmish between 2 vampire houses had been misinterpreted by human witnesses and made its way into the historical record as something else entirely. He pointed out the window of an apartment building 3 streets over, Where? He told her with the closest thing to shyness she had ever seen in him. He had once spent 6 years living as a professor of classical history under a different name, because the political situation in the court had become too complicated to navigate directly. "You were a professor," she said. "For 6 years," he said. "I was quite good at it." "I believe you entirely," she said. "I have not told anyone else that story," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Not even Thessaly, especially not Thessaly," he said. "She would never let me hear the end of it." She laughed, genuinely, and without the professional warmth that she had spent years developing, and his expression at the sound of it was something she wanted to keep somewhere safe. "Valentina," he said. "Yes, I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to understand that whatever your answer is, it changes nothing between us. The bond exists regardless. My feelings exist regardless. The political situation in the court has resolved in a direction that is considerably more favorable than it was 3 weeks ago. You have nothing to gain or lose from your answer that you do not already have." She turned to face him fully. "Ask the question." He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and produced something that she recognized, even in the low light, as an extraordinarily beautiful ring. Old gold set with a stone that was dark and luminous in a way that she did not think was attributable to any ordinary gemstone. "This was my mother's," he said. "She wore it for 200 years and gave it to me the last time I saw her, which was 1891, and told me to give it to someone worth giving it to." He met her eyes. "I have been waiting for 130 years." Her chest was doing several things simultaneously. "That is," she said carefully, "a very long time to wait. You are very worth the wait." He said. She looked at the ring and at him and at the city below them, and thought about 3 months ago when she had been carrying a tray of wine, and he had walked through the door and changed the temperature of the room, and she thought about every Tuesday, and the wine lists, and the conversations, and the underground chambers, and the political crises, and the great chamber, and his hand on her wrist, and his voice saying her name from the floor where he was kneeling, and she thought about the very specific quality of his attention, and the 300 years behind it, and the professor story, and his mother, and 1891, and 130 years. "Yes," she said. He stilled. "Yes," she said again, clearly, in case the cold air had taken it. "Yes, Vesper, that is my answer." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her, which she thought was either coincidence or something. The very old piece of blood law that had recognized them 3 months ago, had known, and she was only now catching up to. He held her hand afterward in both of his, and looked at it with the expression she had stopped, trying to translate, precisely because some things were better left in their original language. "You should know," she said, "that I am going to keep working at Nachtgold. I assumed as much," he said, "and I am going to need to tell my family something," she said. "My sister already thinks something is happening. She called me last Tuesday and told me I sounded different. Do you want to tell her the truth?" Valentina considered this seriously. Her sister, Clara, was practical and sharp and deeply loyal and would, Valentina calculated, handle the truth with approximately the same approach Valentina herself had taken, which was to gather as much information as possible and ask good questions. "Yes," she said, eventually, "when the timing is right, I would be glad to meet her," he said. "When you determine the timing is right." She looked at him with the ring on her finger and the city below them and his careful, 300-year-old hand still holding hers, and thought that she would probably never stop finding him remarkable, which seemed like a very good quality in a person one intended to spend a significant amount of time with. "I should warn you," she said. "She will absolutely ask how old you are." "I will tell her the truth," he said. "She will then ask a very large number of follow-up questions." "I will answer all of them," he said. "She might also cry," Valentina said. "She cries at things she finds beautiful. She will probably find this beautiful." Something in his expression went very soft. "I will bring good wine," he said. She smiled. "She will love you for that alone." They stayed on the roof for another hour in the cold December air, talking about the things that needed to be resolved, and the things that were already resolved, and the things that were simply about the future, which was a conversation Valentina had not expected to have in quite these terms, but was finding that she wanted very much. He told her about the Nightborne estates in Prague and Budapest, and what they were like in different seasons, and she told him about the region of Spain where her grandmother had lived, in the hills above Seville, and he told her that he knew those hills, that he had passed through them in the 17th century. And she told him that she wanted to go back, and he told her they would go present tense, future orientation, we. She had not realized until this moment how completely she had been living in isolated present tense for most of her adult life, managing each moment as it came, and how different this felt. This sudden vast future full of specific plans. The weeks that followed were busy in the way that the aftermath of resolved crises tends to be, full of documentation and political restructuring, and the careful resetting of alliances that had been disrupted by the events in the Great Chamber. Valentina was present for most of it, which was a shift from her previous position as an observer and a participant in the court's edges, and she handled the shift with the precision and emotional steadiness that had characterized her from the beginning. Thessaly, who had been a watchful ally throughout and who had, Valentina learned, been quietly prepared to use every legal mechanism at her disposal to protect the bond. If the tribunal motion had actually been pursued, became something approaching a friend, which was a category that Thessaly did not appear to use loosely, and Valentina valued it accordingly. Calix Seravan, operating now under the formal censure and the suspended voting rights, and the complicated reality of having done a wrong thing and admitted it publicly, kept a careful distance for the first month, and then, gradually, became something that Valentina thought was probably the vampire equivalent of a reluctant ally, which she understood was not nothing, coming from someone whose primary characteristic was calculated self-interest. The court itself changed in texture. Not dramatically, not in ways that dismantled the ancient structures of blood law and hierarchy and old-world protocol, but in the small and significant ways that courts change when the person at the center of them changes in an observable direction. Vesper was not more lenient after the night in the Great Chamber, not softer, not less commanding. He was, if anything, more certain. The particular quality of a person's who has faced the thing designed to consume him and come through it intact, who knows now that the thing that saved him was real and lasting and standing in his court wearing his mother's ring. He was, Valentina observed, happier. Quietly, in the way that very private people express happiness, in the small, sustained quality of their attention, and the occasional moments when the thing adjacent to a smile crossed his face without him managing it away. She was happy too. It looked different on her, because she was less private about it. But it was the same substance. January was cold and beautiful, and Vienna was extraordinary in it. All stone and lamplight, and the particular magic that very old cities carry in winter. She worked her morning shifts at Nachtgold and spent her evenings in the court or in the townhouse above it, which she had begun to think of as a home in the way she had not thought of anywhere as a home in years. And Marco the Matrade, who had worked at Nachtgold for 17 years and prided himself on never being impressed by, anyone observed her one morning with an expression she could not quite read and said, "You are different, Valentina." "In what way?" she asked. "Like someone who knows where they are," he said, which was precise enough that she thought perhaps Marco was less unaware of the nature of certain clients than she had assumed. She told Clara in February, on a Sunday afternoon in Clara's apartment, with a bottle of excellent wine that Vesper had selected and sent with her. Clara listened with her characteristic stillness, which was different from composure, was instead the focused quality she brought to things she wanted to understand completely, and she asked very good questions, most of which Valentina answered fully, and at the end she sat quietly for a moment and then said, "He loves you." "Yes," Valentina said. "And you love him." "Yes, and he is 300 years old, 327. Valentina said Clara was quiet for another moment. Then she cried, briefly, in the way she cried at things she found beautiful, which was exactly as Valentina had predicted. And then she said, "I want to meet him." "I told him you would say that," Valentina said. "He is prepared." "Is he afraid of me?" Clara said, with the combination of warmth and mischief that Valentina had been finding comforting since childhood. "I believe he finds you theoretically daunting," Valentina said, which is a remarkable statement from someone who has governed a vampire court for 3 centuries. "Good," Clara said, "as he should." They met the following week in a restaurant that was not Nachtgold, chosen for a certain degree of privacy. Clara arrived first and was already seated when Vesper came in, and Valentina watched him cross the room with the particular quality of someone who was taking a situation seriously, which he expressed in the precision of his attention rather than in any visible nervousness. And she watched Clara watch him and saw the moment her sister understood something that could not be entirely articulated. The specific quality of him, afterward, when he had stepped away briefly. Clara leaned across the table and said, quietly and with absolute certainty, "He is remarkable." "I know," Valentina said. "Does he know how remarkable you are?" Clara said. "He told me recently that I am the most remarkable person he has encountered in 300 years, Valentina said. Clara smiled slowly, with the full warmth that was her default mode when she was entirely sure of something. "Good," she said again, "as he should." The engagement was not announced publicly, because the vampire court had specific protocols around formal bond recognitions that were separate from the human institution of engagement, and they were navigating simultaneously with the careful precision that had characterized their entire relationship. But within the court the news traveled in the efficient, quiet way that news travels in small insular communities, and the reaction was largely positive, because the court had watched the bond save their lord from the veil consumption, and had drawn the obvious conclusions. Malachar, in exile in Prague, apparently heard through whatever network he maintained, and sent no response, which was itself a response. Valentina considered this, and found she had nothing she particularly wanted to say to him either. So they were even spring came to Vienna in its gradual, specific way, the chestnuts coming into leaf along the Ringstrasse, the quality of light shifting from the blue clarity of winter towards something warmer and more golden. Valentina walked through the city in the mornings with the heightened awareness of someone who has recently had their perception reorganized, seeing the building where the Second Court had met in 1718, the street where the historical record had been inaccurately written in 1854, the ordinary facade of the townhouse in the first district that sat above centuries of remarkable history. She had loved Vienna before. She loved it differently now. One Sunday evening in April, she came down to the court's main chamber after her morning shift and found Vesper where she had increasingly found him lately, in the library that took up an entire wing of the underground complex, working through a stack of documents with the efficient attention he brought to all administrative matters. He looked up when she came in, and the expression that crossed his face, before he managed it back into his professional composure, was the one she had been seeing with increasing frequency and never tired of. And he said, "How was your shift?" "Excellent," she said. "We had an extraordinary table 7. They ordered the last 2 bottles of the 1947 latte. Something moved in his expression. How extravagant of them. "I thought of you," she said. "I thought of you," he said. "Approximately every hour." "Only every hour," she said. "I was being conservative," he said. "I had administrative responsibilities." She sat down across from him at the other end of the library table and began reading the book she had brought with her, which was a history of Vienna in the 18th century that she was reasonably certain he had been present for and was planning to ask him about. They worked in comfortable parallel for an hour, occasionally exchanging words about the documents or the book, and she thought that this was one of the most specific pleasures of her new life, this companionable silence with someone whose presence was its own form of conversation. After a while, he set his documents aside and looked at her across the table and said, "There is a formal recognition ceremony scheduled for the 3rd week of May." She looked up. "The court's formal recognition? For the bond," he said, "under blood law, a resonance bond that has been registered and sustained and publicly demonstrated as viable is entitled to formal court recognition, which carries legal weight within the vampire world and grants the human partner of a lord specific rights, protections, and standing that supersede virtually everything Malachar tried to invoke in the early months." He paused. "It is functionally the vampire court equivalent of a marriage in terms of legal weight. It does not preclude also having a human ceremony if you wanted that as well at some point." She thought about this. "Tell me about the recognition ceremony," he told her. It was old, the ceremony, older than the city above them, rooted in blood law and ancient vow and the particular formality that the vampire world brought to everything significant, and it involved the assembled court as witnesses and specific words in a language older than Latin, and the exchange of something she understood from context to be more meaningful than rings, though the specifics of what they would exchange would be chosen by them, not prescribed. "When you describe it," she said, "you sound like someone who has been thinking about it." "I have been thinking about it since November," he said, "when I realized that it was not the bond creating warmth." She got up from her end of the table and came around to his end, and he turned his chair toward her without being asked, and she sat on the edge of the table by him and looked down at him, and thought that this was probably the most domestic moment she had ever shared with someone who was also 327 years old and governed an ancient underground vampire court. "The 3rd week of May," she said. "If that works for you," he said. "I will check my morning shifts," she said. He looked up at her with those dark eyes and that vast and careful attention. "You are doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Being deliberately grounding," he said. "At a moment of significant emotional weight. It is a gift," she said. "It is," he said. "It is one of the things I love most about you." She reached down and took his face in both hands, the way she might hold something extraordinary, and kissed him in the library under the underground city in April, with the spring somewhere above them, and 300 years of documents on the shelves around them, and the warmth of the bond between them so familiar. Now it was simply part of how the world felt, indistinguishable from being alive. He kissed her back the way he did everything, with complete attention and without hurry, and when she pulled back to look at him, he was looking at her in the way that still, after months, made her want to keep looking at him in return. "The 3rd week of May," she said again. "Yes, I will arrange my schedule." "I appreciate your flexibility," he said. "Do not be sarcastic," she said. "I would never," he said, and this time the thing adjacent to a smile arrived fully, unheld, and she thought that might be the best thing she had ever seen in a library, which was also saying something considerable. The formal recognition ceremony was held on May 17th in the great chamber, which had been transformed for the occasion into something that Valentina had no precise vocabulary for, all candlelight and ancient tapestries, and the particular density of air that accumulated when very old things were treated with the seriousness they deserved. The assembled court was dressed in the old-world formality that vampire ceremonial occasions required, all dark fabrics and cold silver and the gravity of people, for whom formal occasions had actual historical weight. Thessaly, who was managing the ceremony's logistics with her characteristic brisk efficiency, had told Valentina the night before to wear whatever she felt herself in, which was either the most helpful or least helpful instruction she had ever received, and she had chosen a dress that was dark and simple and exactly right in the way that she knew something was exactly right, without being able to articulate the specific criteria. Clara came. Valentina had asked, and Vesper had arranged her access and welcome in the court with the precision he brought to things that mattered to Valentina, and Clara arrived in the good dress she wore for genuinely significant occasions, and sat in the front of the tiered seating, and looked around the underground chamber with the focused attention she had brought to learning everything. Valentina had told her about this world, and caught Valentina's eye across the room, and did the small hand gesture they had used since childhood to signal that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Valentina smiled and felt her eyes go warm. Vesper was at the center of the chamber when she walked in the formal dark coat that was his ceremonial dress, and his white hair not swept back as usual but loose, which she had not seen before, and which made him look ancient and remarkable, and so specifically himself that she stopped for a moment at the entrance to simply look at him. He was already looking at her. The ceremony proceeded in the old language, conducted by Thessaly in her capacity as the court's primary record keeper, and Valentina had spent 3 weeks learning the responses she needed to give, which were not complicated, but which mattered because they were precise, and she gave them precisely, in the correct cadence, without stumbling, which caused a small ripple of something through the assembled court that she interpreted as approval, and Thessaly afterward confirmed had been exactly that. What they exchanged was not rings. She had given him Earlier that week, a small thing, a pressed four-leaf clover found in a park in Vienna on a morning walk, sealed carefully in glass, the most human possible object in the most human possible good fortune tradition, chosen because it was entirely honest and entirely her, and she thought he would understand all of that. He had laughed, which was a sound she was still cataloguing because it was rare and wonderful, and told her it was the best thing anyone had given him in a century, and she believed him entirely. He gave her, in the ceremony, a piece of paper in the old language, which Thessaly translated for the court in the formal manner, and which turned out to be a deed recorded in the Nightborne Charter as an official document, officially designating her as a partner in the governance of the Nightborne bloodline, with all rights, protections, and standing therein. Not a symbolic gesture, a legal reality, as real within this world as anything she had ever held. She read it twice in Thessaly's translation, and looked up at him, and he was watching her with the expression that she had been unable to translate and no longer needed to, and she thought that he had known, with the particular precision of someone who paid very close attention, exactly what she would value most. Afterward, when the formal proceedings had concluded, and the assembled court had offered their recognitions in the ancient formal manner, which involved gestures she had learned and could return properly now, Clara appeared at her elbow and said nothing for a moment, just pressed her shoulder briefly against Valentina's in the way she had since they were small, and then said quietly, "You look like someone who has found their place in the world." "I think that is what happened," Valentina said. "Good," Clara said, for the third time, with all the same conviction she had brought to it every time. Vesper came to find them after he had completed the required post-ceremony acknowledgments, and he greeted Clara with the formal courtesy that was natural to him, and she received with the warmth that was natural to her, and Valentina stood between them and thought that the world was very large and contained a remarkable number of things she had not known about until recently, and was extremely glad to know about now. "Thank you," he said to Clara, with the particular precision of someone choosing their words carefully, because they meant to honor something specific, for trusting her judgment when she needed someone to. Clara looked at him steadily. "She has always had excellent judgment," she said. "Even before you, especially before me," he agreed. "Her judgment about most things, including me, has been significantly better than my own." "Good," Clara said. "As long as you know it, I know it," he said, with the thing that was now fully a smile. "She reminds me when I forget." "She does that," Clara said with great affection, and not a small amount of satisfaction. Later, much later, when the court had settled into the quieter rhythm of the post-ceremony gathering, and Clara had been safely transported home in the care of one of Vesper's people, who had been briefed to be extremely helpful and completely discreet, and Thessaly had declared the evening's records complete and departed with her characteristic efficiency. Valentina and Vesper were back on the rooftop of the townhouse in the first district, because it seemed to be where they went when they needed to be in the world, but slightly above it. The city was lit below them, spires and the lampposts, and the dark glimmer of water in the distance. May in Vienna was extraordinary. May in Vienna, with the warmth of what was between them, so established. Now it was simply atmospheric. The background condition of everything was something she did not have words for in any language she currently spoke. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. "I am thinking that 3 months ago I was carrying a tray of wine, and you walked through the door," she said, "and I have not once, since that moment, wished it had gone differently." "Not even in the great chamber," he said. "Especially not in the great chamber," she said, "because that was the moment we said the true thing." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the city. "Malacca told me in the first month that the bond was the worst decision I had made in 3 centuries, he said, "that a human was a liability and a weakness, and that I would come to regret it." And, she said, he turned to look at her in the May night, with the city below, and the ring on her finger, and the deed in the court's formal record, and 327 years of careful attention now directed entirely and without reservation at her. And, he said, he was wrong about every single thing. She took his hand, the same hand that had held her wrist in the great chamber, and held it differently, the way 2 people hold each other's hands when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. "Everyone told the human waitress the bond was a mistake," she said. "Until it saved the vampire lord from the darkness," he said. "Until it saved the vampire lord from the darkness," she agreed, "which I think argues rather definitively for the bond." "I think it argues rather definitively for you," he said. She looked at him with everything she had, which was not nothing, had never been nothing, and thought that this was the beginning of a very long story, with an extraordinary person in a world larger than she had known existed, and that every part of it, the difficulty and the danger and the beauty and the warmth and the ancient corridors and the candlelit chambers and the rooftop in May, had been worth exactly what it had cost. "Good," she said. For the first time, in the way Clara had always said it, with all the convictions it deserved, he brought her hand to his mouth again, as he had on the night she had said yes. And this time she felt the warmth of it not just in her arm, but everywhere, through the bond and through everything that was simply her, and Vienna stretched out below them in the May night, and the court beneath the city was quiet and settled and theirs, and the future was very long and full of specific plans, and Valentina Wolfe stood on the rooftop beside Vesper Nightborne and knew, with the same bone-deep certainty she had felt in the great chamber with her hand against his chest, that this was permanent and real and entirely right. It had always been going to be this. From the first changed temperature of a room on a November Tuesday, from the first extraordinary wine and the first glass of water offered in a back corridor, from the first candlelit corridor and the first political crisis, and the moment the darkness had met the warmth and found it immovable, it had always been going to be this. She was very glad she had known it early. She was very glad she had held her ground.